Good day, Silvercresters. Our topic for today is all about factors of perfect square trinomial. But before we proceed in our topic, which is factoring, first let's define what is a perfect square trinomial. Perfect square trinomial is a result of the square of a binomial. It can be factored just other trinomials, but if you recognize the perfect square patterns, follow the formula. So what are those formulas? We have here two set of examples. Now, reminders. I use A and B as representations for our two variables. Okay, remember that. Not all the time we use A and B as a variable. Sometimes other letters in alphabets. Now, so first example is we have here A squared plus 2AB plus B squared, which result to the quantity of A plus B squared. So how it comes? So from that, we have here A squared, and the third term or last term is a perfect square, okay? Which result to this. Then after that, we have here the second one, which is A squared minus 2AB plus B squared, which result to the quantity of A minus B squared. Again, we have here a sample of perfect square trinomial as a formula. Therefore, that is our guide for factoring a perfect square trinomial. Let's have our first example for perfect square trinomial. Observe, we have here x squared plus 8x plus 16. Now, the question is it a perfect square trinomial? And another question is, how can we identify that it is a perfect square trinomial? So now we have here some notes or conditions before we conclude that our given is a perfect square trinomial. Now, first condition, a trinomial must consist of three terms or three monomials. From our example, we have here x squared, 8x, and 16. Therefore, we have three terms or three monomials. Now, after that, we have here, we need to check if the given is a perfect square trinomial. It must consist of the following conditions. From that, we must have a sub-conditions. What are those conditions? First, the first term and last term are both perfect square. So from our example, x squared is a perfect square. Why? Since we have here a variable, then the exponent must be the condition. To identify whether a variable is a perfect square, we use our exponent as the guide. Once our exponent is an even number for our variable, therefore it is a perfect square. Then after, we have here the last term must be also a perfect square. Now, we have here 16, which is also a perfect square because the multiples of 16 is 4 times 4. Okay, therefore we have here x squared is equal to x times x, and 16 is equal to 4 times 4. Then after, the middle term must be twice the product of the square root of the first term and last term. Means we have here the specific condition that our middle term must be twice the product of the square root of first term and last term. 2 times the square root of first term times the square root of last term. Once we written that, we have here 8x is equal to twice or 2 times x plus 4. Wherein twice means 2 times the product of the square root of first term and the square root of last term. Now, we can conclude that our given is a perfect square trinomial. Now, how can we factor out that? So let's continue. Again, our given is x squared plus 8x plus 16. Now, how can we factor this PST or perfect square trinomial? Now, these are the steps in factoring perfect square trinomial. First, we get the square root of the first and last term. Therefore, we must have the square root of x squared, which is x, then the square root of 16, which is 4. Since our first step, get the square root of first and last term. The first term is x squared and the last term is 16, which result to x and 4. Then after, use the sign of the middle term of the trinomial between these roots. In short, or we will use the sign of our middle term, which is positive. Then after, we put the square root of first term as our first term in our binomial and the square root of last term, which is 4, as the last term of our binomial. Then next, raise the binomial obtained in the step 2 to the second power, in which we just put square here or exponent as 2 for our binomial. In short, this is our final answer. Therefore, the factor of x squared plus 8x plus 16 is the quantity of x plus 4 squared. So from that, remember that we have steps in factoring perfect square trinomial. Let's try another example. Let's have here our second example. Factor 25x squared minus 20x plus 4. Now, our first step is to identify if the given is a perfect square trinomial. Remember that we have conditions before we conclude that our given is a perfect square trinomial. So what are those? First condition, our trinomial must consist of 3 terms. Probably we have here first term, which is 25x squared. Second term is negative 20x. And the third term is 4. So therefore, we have here a trinomial. Now, the next step is our first and last term must be a perfect square. So from our example, 25x squared is a perfect square and 4 also is a perfect square. Now, so last condition for perfect square trinomial, our middle term must be twice the product of the square root of first term and last term. Again, the middle term or the second term must be twice the product of the square root of first term and last term. 2 times square root of 25x squared times the square root of 4. Okay? So from that, what is the square root of 25x squared? So the result of 25x squared is 5x. Then the square root of 4 is 2. Now, 2 times 5x times 2, the answer is 20x, in which they are the same. In short, we have a perfect square trinomial. So therefore, we are done with the step 1. Now, what is the step 2? So step 2, get the square root of the first and last term, in which we already get that. Here, the square root of 25x squared and the square root of 4 is 5x and 2. In short, we have here the answer or the square root of first and last term. Therefore, we are done with that. Step 3. Use the sign of the middle term of the trinomial between those two roots. Means we use our sign here for middle term, which is negative sign for our binomial. Or we create a parenthesis wherein the symbol of that is negative. Why? Just because the sign of our middle term is negative. Therefore, we use negative as the symbol for our binomial. Then after, we write the square root of first term as the first term, which is 5x. Answer for the square root of last term, which is 2. We're done with step 3. Then last step is raise the binomial obtained from the step 2 to the second power. In short, we just write squared outside the parentheses. Again, we write squared or 2 as the exponent of our binomial. In other words, we have here the quantity of 5x minus 2 squared as our final answer for our example number 2. So I think we're done with that. So now remember that we have a certain conditions we have a certain conditions before we conclude that our given is a perfect square trinomial. Remember those conditions. Again, our first condition is it must consist of 3 terms, followed by the next step or next condition, followed by next condition, which is the first and last term must be a perfect square. Third condition, our middle term must be twice the product of the square root of first term and last term. Now, we have steps in factoring a perfect square trinomial. Remember, our first step is we must find the square root of first term and last term. Then after, we use the symbol of our middle term. We use the symbol or sign of our middle term as the sign for our binomial. Then after, we write a parenthesis. The square root of first term must be the first term of our variable or first variable. Sorry. The square root of our first term must be the first term of our binomial. Then after, we proceed in our last term or square root of last term as our second term for our binomial. Then the last step, we just write square or 2 as the exponent of our binomial. So now, I hope that we are clear with factors of perfect square trinomial. That's all for now. Have a nice day.